The ability to effectively communicate has always been key to doing business, especially through voice systems. Businesses are constantly looking for easier and more cost-effective ways to deploy and manage their communication platforms. Now, joining me in studio to talk about voice as a service is Angus Hay, Chief Technology Officer at Neotel, Andy Baker, the CEO of the Nashua Group, and Moodley, Regional Manager of Data Center and Virtualisation at Cisco South Africa. A warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining me. I think let's start off with you, Angus. When it comes to defining voice, the lines have been blurred. So let's talk about voice and define it for us. Give us a definition.
Okay. I mean, in the good old days, I think everybody knew what voice was. Yeah. Voice was when you picked up the telephone and spoke on it. Nowadays, obviously, a lot of that is mobile. But the reality is that voice has become a service. It's become an application. It's become something that we add to data networks. So there was a time when voice was a standalone network, a standalone system. But today, it's very much part of a converged set of services. Absolutely.
So a more hybrid scenario that we're looking at. Val, over to you. The concept of voice as a service. You can put it into perspective for us, where we stand right now.
Yeah, I mean, service providers are looking at how do they provide voice as a service to their consumers on an as and when needed basis. That requires them needing to take the central call control, either the PBX or the call manager, etc., into a central point and manage it within what we would call a cloud, and then provide those services as and when needed. They can even get down to billing, singular call billing, etc. So it's providing what the consumer needs when and where needed.
Okay, and you, Andy, you can put it into perspective for us in terms of the size and the shape, not only in South Africa, but also on the rest of the African continent. Startling numbers that we're looking at.
Well, Angus touched on the convergence, which is blurring the edges. But, I mean, the scale of the market here in South Africa on a fixed line basis, we have a market of around 65 billion rand a year. And the mobile environment is probably 2.5, 3 times that. So we have a very, very big market to play in. And with those converging technologies and converging services between the fixed and mobile, it's an exciting space. But in Africa, on the African continent, out of almost 1 billion people on the African continent, there are 500 million cell phone subscribers, which is absolutely dramatic.
So in other words, 50% penetration rate on the continent.
50% penetration rate in Africa, which is, I mean, it just shows the enormity of the market, which is about 10% of the global cellular coverage.
And I think it's worth noting that you know, of those subscribers, the vast majority are still using voice. In South Africa, we're seeing a shift towards data, but for the majority of the African continent, voice is the dominant service. That doesn't mean necessarily that it's the dominant form of revenue in the long term, but it's certainly the dominant service to be used.
And this is the perception, perhaps, where we say that voice, in a sense, is dead. At least voice profits have been put to bed. But it's not the case in Africa, Angus, because in South Africa, yes, we're still paying very high prices, juxtaposing that to what people in Africa are paying, and you can't really compare because the prices are even higher on the continent.
Yeah, I think it's certainly true. Firstly, the voice market is far from dead. There's still a huge amount of money to be made by service providers in voice, and that's largely because it's a volume-based business. Our parent company, Tata Communications, is the largest carrier of wholesale voice minutes in the world. They carry something like 40 billion minutes per annum. But those are carried at very, very small fractions of a US cent margin, and that's really where the voice market is going globally. So I think we'll certainly see that voice continues to be the primary form of communication for most people. But it's certainly moving towards a market which is very much commoditized and very much based on more efficient ways of carrying that voice, so that the actual cost of a call comes down.
And Val, I think you also hit the nail on the head when you mentioned the cloud. And when you think of the cloud, we think of data, not so much voice.
Yes, but you know, with voice over IP and what voice over IP gives you the ability to do, it's overlaying voice on an IP network. It's now all converged into one single network. That decreases your costs, bring your costs down, and it creates higher profitability for the service provider, which is fundamentally, and some of those cost savings can be passed on to the consumer. And fundamentally, that's where the infrastructure is quite critical in the way it's being provided. Like Angus said earlier, many service providers used to have a separate voice network and a separate data network. Now they just have a single infrastructure. They reach economies of scale by bringing down their capex, increasing their opex, and being able to pass on some of those cost savings.
Andy, okay, so let's look at the categories of voice service. And which category is going to grow the fastest, would you say?
Well, I think firstly to pick up on what Angus said in terms of the voice as a revenue stream is far from dead. As we sit here today, probably 80% of the revenue for telcos is generated from voice and 20% from data. And we'll see that shifting in the next 4 or 5 years.
In Africa or globally?
Across Africa, and I think that if you look globally, they're more advanced in terms of the transition from voice to data. But we could probably realistically and safely assume that in the next 4 to 5 years, those percentages will shift so that 80% of the revenue for telcos will be generated from data and 20% from voice. But voice and data are merging. So what Val was talking about voice over IP, over internet protocol, where voice is now being transmitted on a data pipe. And that's really the big development. So voice is data. So this is really the trend that we're moving towards.
Okay, in terms of, and we're talking about revenue flows and profits, because at the end of the day it does come down to either margins or it comes down to volumes. It's a very costly exercise. Do you think that at this point in time the telecoms companies in South Africa and in Africa are being fair in terms of the pricing power that they have?
I think it would be unfair of me to comment on that, but I think what is fair to say is that the South African consumer is spending an awful lot on communication expense. And we're among the highest cost per call in the world. Now that will come down. We've seen it start dropping already. I saw a report recently at Vodacom saying that since 2009 to date, their average cost per call has dropped 32%. Within the Nashua group, it's slightly less than that, but there is a trend downwards. I mean, that's clear because of the interconnect rate drops. Now there has been a regulated interconnect rate drop for next March 2012 and March 2013. So we will definitely see the cost of communication dropping, which is great news for the consumer. Fantastic news for the consumer.
Well, just to touch on that regulation, I think there's no doubt that we've seen improvements driven by the changes in regulation. What they really do is change the competitive nature of the market. The change in interconnect rates is all about changing the competitive market. But there are a few more things that still have to happen. One interesting example is that, and I think a lot of people don't realize this, you can't yet make a toll-free call from a mobile phone in South Africa, for example. Now that's
very good observation, Angus.
That's a result of regulation not being applied. So we've been pushing quite hard to get true toll-free calls, for example, between operators. And that's the kind of area where we still need some intervention from the regulator. But I think for the rest, certainly the interconnection rates have helped a lot to improve the competitive nature. And then obviously competition drives pricing. Absolutely.
And with regards to competition, we know that some players are falling behind and others really have a very strong hold on the market in South Africa. What is going to drive competition going forward? Is it about regulation and regulatory aspects changing in the country, or is it just between the players themselves wanting to come out top?
I think it will be about the players wanting to come out top. I think it's going to be about the breadth and the depth of services that they're going to offer to the consumers and corporates, because many corporates want to get rid of their core businesses. I mean, keep their core business and get rid of the infrastructure that's not core to them. Managing a voice PBX is not necessarily core to many corporates out there, and they want to give that to somebody whose capability that is. Fundamentally, the service providers that are going to provide the best quality of service, the most cost-effective price, are going to be the ones that are going to go on top.
Cost-effective price, yes, indeed, and also it's about quality, as you mentioned. Your view on that, Andy?
Well, I think the point that Val was mentioning is that as prices drop, and they surely will, we've seen it happening already, and they're going to continue to drop, as I've indicated, over the next 2 to 3 years. They'll drop fairly dramatically. The necessity will be for operators and service providers to make sure they run lean operations and efficient operations so they can still make money. There will certainly be some consolidation in the marketplace as weaker businesses who've built up fat during the heydays fall by the wayside. There will definitely be consolidation.
Do you think that right now we do not have a very lean telecoms industry in South Africa?
I don't think we do, no.
Well, you're saying you're agreeing with that. We don't have a lean telecoms industry.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's, we're getting there. We are definitely on the road to getting there, and we're improving on it. But I still think we've got a way to go. I think the telecoms industry, both in South Africa and in Africa, are starting to put in the right platform infrastructure, etc., to be able to create that cost-effective platform.
What would you change from a cost efficiency perspective? What do you think needs to go?
Look, I mean, running dual networks, running dual infrastructure, needing to reduce your capex cost means that you have to put in a single infrastructure that's going to be able to generate the services, etc., that you need to provide. Reducing capex and opex is critical, and it's key. And advancements in technology gives our service providers the ability to do that.
Like reducing capex and opex. I mean, can we actually do that at a time where we need to see the infrastructure roll out?
No, look, I mean, there's a certain amount of capex that any telco needs to spend. But I think the optimization of that capex is exactly the point. I mean, certainly from our experience, it's about having a single platform that you can put all of the services over. It's about that converged network. We are positioning ourselves very much in the IP space, the Internet Protocol space. And we think of ourselves as a leader in the IP space rather than in the telephone space. And the reason for that is that everything that we do, all of the services, particularly in the corporate space, what we're delivering is voice over IP and internet over IP and virtual private networks over IP. So what we're able to bring to a customer, for example, is a big pipe. Yeah. And the big pipe is IP. And the efficiencies that we can then get out of that mean that we can add value. And I think that's just to counter the point about what needs to happen to make us lean. I think we don't just need to be lean, we need to be smart as well. So we need to be adding more value because particularly in the enterprise space, the demand is for more value. So for a corporate not to be running all its own systems, incurring its own operational expenditure, having to have that room full of equipment, all of that needs to move to a more efficient way of operating, which can be hosted PBXs, it can be working on a platform where you've converged the voice and data network so that everything is over the same platform. And ironically, one of the things that you get out of that, because data networks have always been treated as backbone infrastructure for corporates. Businesses care a lot about their data networks being available and they have service level agreements. Interestingly, when you put the voice services over the top of that, you actually get a better availability of voice than, for example, old-fashioned copper wires.
Absolutely. Okay, so what's also quite fascinating to note, Angus, is Val mentioned that it seems that the consumers are driving the technological trends. So consumer demand and what consumers actually need, so whether it be a corporate or an actual on-the-ground consumer, they're driving the differences in the trends that are occurring at the top. Would you agree with that?
I think there's no doubt that consumers are the first to discover convergence. I mean, everybody knows that on your smartphone you can use Skype, you can use Google Talk, you can use all kinds of applications on your phone which actually just replace voice services. And the reality is that as many of those things then follow into the enterprise space. But they need to follow into the enterprise space with reliable, available, well-managed and secure services.